I've known her for many years because she was very much involved with the research with Lee McCullough and affect phobia therapy. And then we had the opportunity to work together. I think it was in England at the time, Katie. And you've been a part of the affect phobia therapy community ever since.
I guess for me, it very much started in Oxford when I was learning about psychotherapy, clinical psychology, and most of the teaching was all about cognitive behavioral therapy. And I sort of didn't really feel that fitted with what I wanted to do. And then there was James Mcdonald, a teacher, faculty member at the university, who is the guy in the middle picture in the top, if you can see that. But he gave one lecture, I believe, about short-term psychodynamic therapy, and he showed me this clip of Lee McCullough's work. And I was just overwhelmed, inspired. I just thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I thought like a psychologist does or a therapist does. She was so emotionally connected and going deep, but being very warm. And I just thought that this is it. So I asked about a dissertation project, like, is there anything I can do related to this? Because this is what I find interesting. So together we developed this project where we compared outcomes or pre and post outcomes of initial experiential dynamic therapy sessions. So the trial therapies, those 2 to 3 hour sessions. And this was a project that we set out within the National Health Service, so the clinic that I currently worked, or at that time worked. And so the patients were offered these trial therapies, and we measured pre and post, which was interesting in itself because it was effective as in improving self-esteem, improving remoralization, so hope, that people actually got more hopeful afterwards, and the symptoms reduced. So already after this one session, so that was quite amazing. But I think what was most impactful for me at that time was to see the sessions. So all the sessions were recorded as you would with EDT. And mostly I was like coding a lot of those sessions on the ATOS. So seeing all the therapy sessions in depth, like as a junior therapist, was just amazing. Like this was a great example to have. So for being able to code these sessions or to make sense of what I saw in these recordings, I arranged a trip to Modembad Institute in Norway. And so there we met with Paul and Lene, and I saw Lee McCullough's old office there. And they trained us in how to actually really look in detail at the video, look in detail sort of the exact codings of what you might see, whether this is inhibitory affect, whether this is expressive affect, is this actually a defense, or is this more motivation to increase the defenses, and like all these minute details that I never actually saw before, right? So they really, I felt like I got a big lesson in how to see, what to see in a patient and in an interaction. So that was a major part of my research. And then as a secondary study, so apart from these outcomes, that was great. And we also looked at the process itself within those 10-minute segments. I don't know if you're familiar with the ATOS, but it's coded per 10 segments. So we were looking at actually what predicts affect experiencing as that being sort of the short-term outcome that you want within the session. And this was a project together with Peter Lilliegren, who contacted me once I published the initial data and said, this is fantastic data, we should do something with this. So we worked together on that and did some fancier multi-level modeling, controlling for the therapist. And then we found that actually the insight into your defenses or your patterns and the motivation to give those up predicted the level of affect experiencing. So that was very interesting. And I think that was my first experience of really this link with detailed process and outcome. And that still gets me very excited. So that was definitely helped me to get hooked on EDT. And then I don't know whether that had a big impact for you, Kristen, but for me it did. When I reviewed your book on the paraverbal communication, and reading about this emphasis on the nonverbals, on the movements, on the speech, on how people are saying things, on how people, whether they're close together, not close together, and this whole I guess, integration of different literature that I've been fascinated about. So Beatrice Beebe's work on infrared observation and Tronic's work, and then there's a lot about Lachtel's work, Boston Process Research Group, and all these things that I've been excited about, like came together, or at least had something in common in the focus on this paraverbal aspects of the interaction in the therapy. So that's like just endorsed my excitement about EDT. Then in the meantime, I think it was very, very helpful for me to know that there were people conducting randomized controlled trials on outcomes. So there was actually, it wasn't some kind of flaky dynamic therapy that was against research. No, there were actually groups of people, and of course Alan Abbas and his team been producing paper after paper showing that this type of therapy can be effective. So in that sense, it had some validity to me, like it's important and can be effective, not just in my own personal experience, but also in research. And then on that, I think what got me really excited about EDT is the therapist and their eagerness to learn and to develop. Like this whole idea of watching your recordings, getting feedback, even though you're very senior, you still have a supervisor, you get feedback, you develop little tasks of things you need to practice over and over again to make sure you get better. So the focus on continuous learning and professional development and using the recordings of what you're doing to improve yourself all the time. That is just, to me, what it should be like. It would be naive to think that we would know everything after a graduate school or some basic training. So I feel like this is fair and important.
Well, it sounds like, Katie, like you have you discovered like the joy and science of coding video segments on your own. And then you discovered how to do it with other people. And really that's where the magic happens, when you're humbled by the fact that you're not capable of seeing everything. But as a whole, with a group of other clinician researchers, there's so much more data that's available, so many other perspectives to take. And there is a real joy in doing it together, even when there's those arguments about whether or not that was a true affect exposure. Was that adaptive sadness or was that maladaptive sadness, right? And then to see how you really, I could understand, like with the paraverbal book, that all these other orientations can come together in order to serve our understanding of looking at video segments of psychotherapy and coding it. And then what I'm hearing is finally discovering, like, okay, what is the roadmap for a clinician researcher who wants to improve their technique, who wants to face like what affect phobias are coming up for them, and how can they make that happen? And so here you are.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And because this is, I think, what you were talking about earlier, or my, whether it's internal conflict or always sort of what two things that are on my mind is how to combine this importance of my intuition and subjectivity and what's really going on and what I'm experiencing with my patient and in real life practice. And then the other side in me that says, well, actually, but we need to really think about this research evidence. How can we measure things? How can we objectively make sense of data, and that it isn't just me and my quirky self? And how can we integrate and combine these things? I feel like that's always what I'm wondering about. And I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule, but I feel like that's sort of the balance. And I feel that comes back in sort of the three roles that I have currently as a clinician and a researcher and an educator. So I teach at Yeshiva University. I teach clinical doctorate students in clinical psychology. And for example, one of the courses I teach is on evidence-based psychodynamic therapy. And that's for the first year students. And then, of course, a whole discussion starts about what is evidence-based and all this stigma about psychoanalytic therapy, psychodynamic therapy, that it couldn't be evidence-based. So it's very exciting to sort of to delve into that discussion of what that might look like, and to get students excited, not to think that everyone's on the couch for a million sessions without any literature backing it up, but actually there's a lot going on. As a researcher, as a clinician, that's just what I'm trying to combine all the time, trying to find a balance between. So currently in my role as assistant professor, I have a research lab that focuses on some psychodynamic therapy, but generally psychotherapy process and outcome research and psychotherapy training research. I guess that's for me, it's sort of the focus on how can we make psychotherapy evidence-based and how can we make training evidence-based in the psychotherapy. That's sort of the questions that I'm
That's fascinating. Yeah. So, I mean, you're bringing like what we bring to psychotherapy to the psychotherapist. That's really interesting. What have you discovered applying evidence-based to psychotherapists? What hunches do you have right now?
The very honest answer would be we know very little. Like I think that is a very honest start.
Oh, we're going to push you on that answer, Katie.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I think that we need to be very humble, I think.
Yeah,
We think that we know what we're doing, but actually we know very little about what goes on in the therapy relationship and what makes that effective. We know that the therapeutic relationship is one of the most important parts, but we don't know much. I would say what we do know, and I'm just going to go forward a little bit, is that what we need to do is we need to measure. We actually need to know, to track what we're doing, because whatever modality you're going to say is working, or whatever technique you think is effective, or what we first need to do is to make sure that we can track, we can know when something improves or when a patient is doing better, that it's not just your intuition and your sense, but it's actually the patient telling you something changed, or I'm doing a little better. And that includes tracking the therapeutic relationship, because I think we all provide or try to provide a good therapeutic relationship and tend to be warm people, but actually we're not successful always in creating this bond and this agreement on what you're doing in treatment. So I think that the humble answer would be we need to just start with measuring, knowing what we're doing, and not just at the beginning of treatment and then a year later, but actually session by session, how are things going? We need to be open to that feedback.
I know, Katie, like at the last CEPI conference, I was presenting on affect experience and character change. And when I looked at all my cases, what I discovered is every single patient who demonstrated character change, there was a breakthrough in self-other restructuring. And it always came back down to the relationship. And did they have a change in sense of self, and did they have a change in sense of others? And so I found that really interesting, that's what I saw in all my cases.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, I think it's fantastic that you look at it in that detail, right? Because do you actually, or do people have the time in their busy practices to really go back to sessions and do these ATOS codings and really understand what's going on, and maybe not. And maybe these self-report measures are limited in many ways, but at least they are a starting point of some kind of tracking that we can do. And I guess to put some rationale for that, we know that like about 50% of your patients, like that would be expected in normal practice, so 50% of your patients improve. Then there are people who deteriorate, actually get worse seeing you, people who drop out, and people who just don't really change at all. Now, of course, it's much nicer to focus on the ones that improve and you feel great and they feel great and it's all fantastic. But the problem is that we might not be so aware of the people who don't, or at least that's what research suggests, is that we are not very good at predicting who's going to drop out or who's going to deteriorate. So we need some input, some data to tell us that. And what I find interesting is that even if you track these session by session symptoms and therapeutic alliance, that itself, that you get the feedback, makes the treatment more effective. So the likelihood of your people who are not doing so well improving is much higher if you get the feedback.
A quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Just a quick one. 50% of patients improve in all therapy or dynamic therapy?
This is a general psychotherapy number. I know there are different publications that will give you slightly different numbers. Do you have a sense of how psychodynamic might compare to other treatments?
No.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I
I
think that's
think, I think, Katie, though, like for the clinician researchers that are listening, this platform that you have gives clinicians the opportunities to have their patients give them feedback right after a session, because they can just hop online, fill out the questionnaire. And then a clinician is much more aware week to week, session to session, just, what is the client saying about the treatment? How are they doing in terms of their symptoms? And it can be a lot, especially if somebody's working with, insurance based psychotherapy, which is 45 minutes in the United States. It can be difficult to not only, help a patient experience and express emotions that they're avoiding, but to also do all that hard work of finding out, like, well, how is this experiencing happening here? How effective is the treatment? How effective is this session? And I mean, I know when I only have 45 minutes to work with, suddenly I become overwhelmed with how the heck am I going to be able to do everything that's expected of me in order for it to be termed like good treatment, right? And so here you have a platform that patients can go to after a session, and then clinicians can look at it before the next session to see like how things are going.
right.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, I think what is interesting, so this really improves your outcomes when your treatment is not going so well, right? Or your patient is not on track to do well. But actually, if your treatment's doing fine, your patient's doing fine, it doesn't harm either. Like it's not going to add anything because it's already going fine. It's not harmful, And what I think is, sorry, were you going to say something, Jo?
I just wanted to ask, is the platform a trans-diagnostic platform? Trans-theoretical, sorry, a trans-theoretical platform?
Yes. So we'll come to the platform, but yes, it's I guess what I'm talking about here is the measurements, the self-report patient data, and then we'll talk a little bit about the recordings of the sessions. That in itself is relevant across psychotherapies. Of course, I'm very excited about experiential dynamic therapy exactly because therapists are far more open-minded towards looking at evidence, towards recording, making sense of data, learning, self-improving, deliberate practice. All that fits very well, I think. So I think it's particularly suited for EDT-oriented therapists, but the platform could be used by anyone.
Well, absolutely, Katie. And I mean, you're a part of the experiential dynamic therapy family, but the fact is that there's a lot of other orientations out there, and all the research tools that you use can be applied to them. And that's really exciting because down the road, you're going to have the opportunity to be able to look at the experiential dynamic therapist, the cognitive behavioral therapist, the psychodynamic therapist, and compare outcomes, which can be really good, for research.
Yes. And I mean, I think the modalities, that in itself is a very interesting research topic in itself. What we found so far is that people who think they use a certain modality actually use techniques from other modalities also. Most therapists are, when you look at their sessions and what they're doing, actually more integrative than they think they are. That's even what we've been finding in long-term psychoanalysis, where people had like psychoanalytic training for years and really thought that that's what they're doing. They're actually also adhering to some of the practices from CBT and other approaches too. I think that's, it seems to be more in our minds necessarily than what we see in the sessions themselves. But yeah, I'm sure we can talk more about that.
Yeah, for anyone who enjoys tweeting, Marv Goldfried, you have to follow him because he talks a lot about this. And, king of CBT, maybe. So
yes, exactly.
Thanks, Katie. Go on.
No, so I'm talking about why I think what we need to start doing is measuring session by session. I think that even if it's not going to be your main reason for making a change in your treatment, it's an additional data point, right? So if you think about evidence-based practice, we have the data point of our own clinical training, clinical intuition, we have the patients, their preferences, and then we also have the research literature, and then now what the patient is telling you with regards to self-report measures on what is going on with regards to their symptoms and how they perceive the relationship is another data point to consider. So of course it doesn't mean that if all of a sudden your patient is doing poorly on this measure that you are doing something wrong necessarily. Or it might be that they're over-reporting or that they're under-reporting, or there might be all sorts of clinical reasons why they might be reporting something, or might be something going on totally external to the session, outside of the session. But it's a data point to consider. I think that's what I would say. And I think that using it myself, or what is actually, regardless of the content of what they communicate, the fact that patients are able to tell you something about what they experience gives them agency and a way to be involved and to collaborate and to be engaged in the therapy process. So that in itself makes the treatment more a collaboration. And I think it actually helps to get the patient more involved and engaged. Of course, you need to make sure that you look at the measure and you actually refer to it and do something with it. But I think in that sense, it's a helpful tool. And of course, for supervision, if you think about supervisors, and I'm sure many of you are supervisors, when you have supervisees with many patients, like how do you determine which patient you're going to look at, or which particular session within a patient treatment you're going to look at? And these kind of measures might give you such information, right? Or even the tracking of whether someone's suicidal or not. Like that might be helpful if you are the safety net for your supervisee to be able to see, okay, there's something going on with this patient. Can we at least talk about this patient? So I think it's informative for the supervisory relationship too. As someone who believes in integration and real life use, you can use it in different ways, right? You can use it as just a measure where you're tracking. You can make use of all sort of computerized trajectories that tell you how it compares to other patients. You can use it like every session that you check in about it, or you just review it in supervision. Like there's so many ways in which you can make it your tool with each patient differently. I think that is very important, that it's not forced upon you. It's a tool that you might use in different ways for different patients.
And I think, Katie, I mean, we've done a lot of focus in the Therapist Hour on suicidal ideation. And it is so important to have patients who experience suicidal ideation, especially the ones who have done it chronically, to be able to answer those questions, because it really is too silent in the psychotherapy room, meaning we don't talk about it enough. And here you're going to empower patients to just, speak up and say whether or not they are feeling suicidal, and to be able to do it in a safe way. And then for the therapist to be aware of where they're at too. So I have a feeling it's going to really help those patients who are depressed and who are struggling with the chronic suicidal ideation begin to just talk about, what it's like for them. So the outcome measures are doing the therapy too.
Right, exactly. Yes, it's a therapeutic thing in itself. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Sure.
And what I also love is that, the collaboration that is a part of this platform really moves patients from a victim stance to an empowered stance. That, they're really committed to the work that they're doing with their therapist and taking a lot of responsibility about how that's going.
Yes, for sure. Now, if it's okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about evidence-based training, that I think is just as important as the evidence-based practice and very much related. So I hope that you're all familiar with the concept of deliberate practice. And Tony Romanier's work on that, bringing that to the field of psychotherapy. But the idea of being very specific in observing what you do, getting feedback on exactly what you're doing with regards to certain skills that you might need to improve, set particular guidelines on exactly, I want to practice this, practice it over and over and over and over and over again, see how you're doing, and doing it again and again and again. So this minute skill training that you can do by yourself and together with your supervisor is part of most core trainings, I would say. What we know about that empirically, or at least about therapist training, is shockingly little. So I've been writing a book chapter on therapist training for a licensed therapist, and there is really very little empirical studies to say what kind of training would make you a better therapist. And many of the studies that have been done only use like therapist self-report, or how do you feel that you're doing better, but don't actually give you specific outcomes. But what we do know is that the concept of deliberate practice is effective. Obviously, EDT is effective, so that helps. So deliberate practice in EDT is promising. But I've just conducted a review that's now in press on the use of video recordings as a professional development tool. And again, there's very, very little research. I think there were only 30 studies, of which half were just prevalent studies of how many people used videos, and then like 15 studies saying, okay, is it effective according to therapists or according to their supervisors, and very sort of poorly designed studies. So there is more to research there. But I would argue that video recordings is crucial in deliberate practice, right? In actually being able to understand what you do in a session and what you need to improve upon. The question then is, how would you evaluate a particular training? So if you are like a core training, for example, so there are some theoretical frameworks for that, suggesting that, of course, you can ask like the therapist, did you like it? Do you think you're better in your skills? But then there's, of course, a very important element of actually observing what someone does, right? So the video recordings of the sessions. And I think, as Kristen, you would argue or agree with me that ATOS coding on those video recordings would be very, very helpful in understanding what exactly are you doing. And as we were saying earlier about a measure of symptoms and a measure of alliance, a therapeutic relationship, would give you far more information. So hopefully the idea of a comprehensive core training will ultimately lead to better patient outcome, right? That would be the real outcome of a training.
Yeah, it's so much easier, especially if you're able to look at recording session to session to see like what's missing in a psychotherapy session and to be able to fix it in the next one coming up. You know, and I mean, as we know, a lot of therapists sometimes, because of their own emotional blocks, aren't really aware of them until they see it on the video recording and they go, oh, that was a perfect opening for me to help someone experience their sadness more deeply, and I changed the subject. Why did I do that? Yeah.
It's so hard to watch yourself back. It's horrible, but it's also the only, I feel like the only way to go to really learn, right? It's now I wanted to touch on another element of the clinical research, which is something that I've been focusing on in my lab mainly, and I guess this is very much intertwined with the clinical interest and the search for measurement and objectivity and something concrete to see. So we were talking about the achievement of therapeutic objective scale earlier, but I've also been trained in the patient attachment coding system. So how can we identify patient attachment style? So this is Alessandro Talia in Italy who developed this manual, which also took forever to become a reliable rater on. Similar to the defense mechanism rating scale by Chris Perry. So how to identify exactly which, like where the patient is using defenses, what defense they're using. Then there is now a Q-set version of that where you make codings overall. Then we've just developed a real relationship observer measure to identify how genuine and how real the therapist really is with the patient as another element of the relationship. And the coping pattern system is another coding system that I'm now involved with. And I seem to just always get excited by these things because I want to learn and see what those developers of those manuals see. And of course, then it takes me weeks and weeks and weeks to become reliable, and you get into it, and it's very time intensive, but very clinically interesting, I think, because you go back to video recordings, audio recordings, transcripts of sessions. Now, thinking practically, I think, okay, maybe we should look at some computerized versions of these type of analyses, right? It's like great that I want to do that and spend all these hours, but maybe there are other more efficient ways to do it. So I've been looking at some text analysis, basic text analysis programs, looking at language style matching, for example, which is the use of function words like but, however, I, you, and how those are coordinated between the therapist and the patient together. So how is there synchrony between the number of the length of function words you use and I use over therapy. So I've been doing a few studies on that, looking at the matching of language style across the whole session, but also per speaking turn to see in minute detail how we are responding to each other. And interestingly, I found that actually the patient is following the therapist in the way they use the language rather than the other way around. So it's not that the therapist is attuning to the patient, but it's actually the patient who's adopting the style of the therapist. Now that is of course interesting, but going back to our story about paraverbal communication and nonverbal communication, text analysis is poor, right? There's more to therapy than language. So I've been recently looking into different machine learning applications into psychotherapy research. And I've been getting very excited about the opportunities for predicting adherence to a particular model or predicting outcome of a treatment. And the idea that computers can learn from giving all sorts of data points so that they can actually identify patterns themselves, right, to see what is really going on in a therapy. So I feel like that is the future of psychotherapy research, in that we need to collaborate with computer scientists who know much more about these fancy algorithms and models to understand all the nitty-gritty dimensions of a psychotherapy process, where we have language, but we have facial expressions, how we're looking at each other. We've got speech and the tone of speech, but we also have the type of pauses we have in our language or not have, or body language, and there are like a million things that we should all combine. They're all data points in making sense of the therapy. So I feel like to advance the field further, that would be it. Now, I guess this is my little summary of where I'm at. So EDT, of course, like I'm in. Evidence-based practice, we need to routinely monitor, right? We need to track what we're doing so that we know whether we're doing it okay. And we need to video record our sessions and get some feedback on those video recordings. And for us to be able to do this fancy machine learning or computerized analyses, we need bigger samples of data of what actually really happens in real life. So you in your practice, if everyone doing EDT rather than only focusing on those randomized controlled trials, like that's also important, but I think it's important to know what really happens in everyone's practices in the real world. And for us to collaborate on sharing this information of what's going on and how we can learn from things together, as well as, yeah.
Oh, and Katie, I just want to say, for those of us who are supervisors, this is really helpful with tracking like what a student needs to work on in order to like increase their skills and capacity to do the work. Yeah.
Right. So let me make the move to the deliberate solution, or all these first 4 points were in my mind, and I've been talking about it, moaning about it, and like, what should we do about this? So mainly my husband, Mark Aafjes, but now a bigger team of people have developed a deliberate solution. And this is very exciting. So this is a group of people who includes machine learning experts. So they know all the all the computer analysis and making sense of all the different modalities of information, of speech and language, and body movement, all these kind of things. But it also includes a scientist, Jeff Cohn, who you might know because he's been very involved with Paul Ekman's work on facial expressions and facial action coding. So the idea is that his career has been focusing on trying to identify the emotions in faces and trying to find sort of computerized ways of identifying those. So that is very exciting. And he's also been focusing on tracking symptoms using movement and speech. And so he's like a fantastic expert in the field, part of our deliberate team, who will be able to help us make sense of the data. Now I want to show you briefly what the solution.
And I'm thinking, Katie, I know that we have some questions in the audience, and I don't want you to forget to let people know how to reach you if they want to set up this platform in their practices.
Yes. I can, so that will be let me see the slide after I've got my email address. And I think we'll send the slides out as well, right? Is that the case, Kristen?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess all this building up in my mind, all these processes have led to this development of a deliberate digital platform that will help us, right? If anything, I've learned is that clinicians are busy. We need to make things as smooth and easy and integrated as possible. So it's not going to burden you, but actually help you. So the idea is that we are tracking patient self-report measures before and after the session. So with easy links that patients can use on their phone, their tablet, computer, however is useful to them, and that you get immediate feedback reports on how they are doing. So you get to track, you see the graphs of how they are doing compared to previous patients, and you can see that for all your patients. Then I know that the recording is an issue, apart from just being convinced that recording is important, but it's actually how to store recordings and how to do that safely, how to then share your recording with your supervisor, for example, and how to make sense of the video that you have, right? When you have a whole session, like what are you supposed to look at? What can I gain from it, learn from it? So that is something that we offer and want to offer more and more, starting with transcription of your session, with automatic summaries of what has been spoken about, with bars of arousal when your patient is more aroused, when your patient is less aroused. But there are like a million different things that can be learned and will be added to the platform, identifying size and all sorts of different anxiety markers that we can identify in our patients, and as well as in the interaction with the patient and a therapist. Then the idea is that, like, ideally, I would love you all to participate in this real world evidence in a research repository, so that we can all contribute our sessions and all our scores for these measures together, so that we can learn from it on a big scale. And the idea is then that you get a discounted rate because you allow your data to be used. And that, of course, you can then collaborate on all sorts of studies if you were so inclined. But that is the sort of the synopsis of what is offered. And we've been running a pilot for the last, well, I guess the last year. We've been experimenting with how to develop this platform best and the measurement best. So the real launch will be at the end of the summer with a product that looks smooth and neat and works well. Yeah, maybe I should stop there. Sorry.
Well, absolutely no apologies, Katie. This is just so interesting, and it's too bad that we only have an hour to dive deep into it. One person had a question about how similar is this to Scott Miller's work, and can you just speak about that?
Yeah. No, this is interesting, and it's. So Scott Miller and similar to Mike Lambert, they have all these different routine outcome measurement systems, and what it offers you is it tracks measures, and you get little graphs and see how the trajectories are going. So that part is very similar. But of course, what is different is that this also includes the video. So this is not just a self-report measure that we're tracking. This is also making sense of the video, of the recording of what's actually happening in the session. And I think that is the most unique expertise that we offer. Apart from the fact that we can offer all sorts of different measures and we can make it unique to your setting. And of course, it's a sort of individualized or set up, but in a way that might not be that special. I think the most special is the video addition to it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm hoping, Katie, with this new patient that I have who's interested in trying this out with me, I'll try and video record my experience so that I might be able to help walk people through what it's like for them if they give it a try too. It's sure to be entertaining, I'm sure.
That sounds good. That sounds good.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a question? We have Katie here until the end of the hour. Any more questions about her platform and her work? Somebody said, how do we sign up?
Right. So I'll give you here my email address, or katie@deliberate.ai. It's absolutely fine. So please drop me a line, let me know you're interested, and then we can make sure that you get notified as soon as things are ready for you to try, so that you can see really what it's like to use it with your patients.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Can I ask a question?
And maybe, Katie, if you stop sharing your screen, we can see you. It's easier to communicate. Yeah, there we go. Hi, everyone. We missed you.
Can I ask a question, Christine?
Yeah, sure.
If I think about my practice, I think that grosso modo, I see two kinds of patients. Patients who have specific symptoms, let's say phobias, anxieties, depressions, things that can be more circumscribed. But I do also see quite some patients who don't have a very specific symptom that is easy diagnosable with DSM, but they are more existentialistic, crisis. Can you say a few words about how your platform would relate to these two kinds of clients?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the regular symptoms, or if people might come in with anxiety, depression, or that would be part of one of the measurements. And like for example, now we're using the outcome questionnaire with 45 items, different items, also interpersonal functioning, for example. But it's really, you tell me what measure would be useful for a particular patient, and we can integrate that in the system. Like that's not a problem. So if you say, actually, there's a particular measure, or maybe we can help brainstorm what measure might be helpful with regards to more professional growth, or reflective insight, or different measures that might be more suitable to your practice or to a different type of patient, we can definitely offer that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it would be so fascinating to like look at the differences between those two types of patients, because I know like my patients who come in with a lot of symptoms, I mean, we're just so problem focused, right? It's like, how do we resolve these symptoms as soon as possible? Whereas my patients, that it's more existential work. I mean, I'm always so curious to see how deep can we go, right? And what happens there. So it'd be lovely to be able to compare the two.
Right.
And you would be able to do this on this platform because you'd have access to all the data and could even analyze between your patients.
Yes, exactly. Of course, the most interesting work is the combination of what happens in the session according to the recording and what you get with regards to the measurements that are important to you. Yes.
Right. And I mean, Katie, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, you decide to introduce measures for the therapist in terms of like what was their experience session to session. And then how do you compare like what the patient's experience was and the therapist experience?
Yes. Well, you should see my list. I've got documents of list of, if it were up to me, what I would like people to complete. But of course, you need to be realistic, and everyone's super busy, and so it needs to be doable. But yes, yeah.
Yeah, well, I know. I mean, Katie spearheads a study called the Therapist Phobia study that can be used for, anyone who's doing training of psychotherapists. In fact, if you're interested in getting involved with that, you could email her. And there's a lot of different questionnaires to fill out, and it's always a question about how able are students to do that. Yeah, yeah. So. Any other questions? We'll definitely send Katie's email as well as her PowerPoint, and in the PowerPoint is how you can contact her. But on this note, Katie, I want to thank you so much for coming to the Therapist Hour. It's just been lovely to have you here and share like your journey and your work. And I just can't wait to see you on stage 5 years from now, telling us like all the data that you've been able to, gather and the results that you found. So congratulations. What a project.
Thank you all. Thank you. And thank you, Kristen, for organizing.
Yeah. And thanks to everyone for coming. We love to see you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again. So, bye-bye.